I am presenting Union Gospel Presses Sunday School Lesson number 3, Sunday, September 17th, 2023. The lesson is entitled The Fall of Jericho. Lesson text comes from Joshua chapter 6, verses 2 through 4, and verses 12 through 28. Related scriptures are Genesis 15, 16 through 21, Deuteronomy 20, 16 through 18, Joshua 5, verse 13 through chapter 6, verse 1, Hebrews 11:30. The place is Jericho. The time is 1405 BC. Last week we saw how God protects his people. This week we are given a powerful reminder that our God is a victorious God. God teaches us a lesson through the conquest of Jericho. Today's aim, facts, to show how God helped Joshua and his people overcome Jericho by trusting in him. Principle, to show that God is a victorious God who works on the side of those who trust him. Application, to teach that when we trust God, he will make us victorious. Illustrating the lesson. When we are on God's side, victory is always the outcome. We simply need to claim his promises and act in faith. Practical points. 1. You can consider God's promises as good as done. Joshua 6:2, Numbers 23:19. 2. Many of God's promises are conditioned on our obedience. Joshua 6:3 through 4. 3. The best evidence of truth is the Lord is obedience to the Lord. Verses 12 through 13. 4. Never grow weary in obeying the Lord, even in mundane things. Joshua 6:14, Galatians 6:9. 5. Believe in God's promises and encourage others to do the same. Joshua 6:15 through 16. 6. Keep your promises. Our judge is watching. Verses 17 through 19. 7. God's work done God's way will always be victorious. Verse 20. Golden text. It came to pass at the 7th time when the priests blew with the trumpets, Joshua said unto the people, Shout, for the Lord have given you the city. Joshua 6:16. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is what Israel was to do. Joshua 6:2 through 4. The second is what Israel did. Joshua 6:12 through 17. The third is what Israel experienced. Joshua 6:18 through 28. Introduction. The children of Israel were now west of the Jordan River and encamped at Gilgal in the land of Canaan. God had miraculously dried up the river so that the people could cross over into Canaan. Memorials had been set up. Manna had ceased coming from heaven. Circumcision had been performed. And everybody was waiting for the initial phase of conquering the land. As Joshua waited for further instructions, he decided to go out and look over Jericho and make some observations about their first challenge. How were they going to take Jericho before moving on? God is always good to give us the directions we need when we are willing to patiently wait upon him. It might be one of the hardest things we have to do as believers, simply biding our time until he indicates clearly what steps we are to take next. But experience has taught many of us that the only thing harder than waiting on the Lord is wishing we had. What Israel was to do. Joshua 6:2. And the Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given unto thine hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valor. Verse 3. And ye shall compass the city, all ye men of war, and go round about the city once. Thus shalt thou do 6 days. Verse 4. And 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns, and the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow with the trumpets. The promise, Joshua 6:2. Verse 1 tells us that the city of Jericho was securely shut up. Nobody could get in or get out. The people inside the city were surely hoping desperately that their walls would provide the safety they needed to avoid being overtaken by the huge nation now camped at Gilgal. On the other hand, the children of Israel could have been looking at the same security and wondering how they could ever possibly overtake such a fortified city. No doubt tensions were running high on both sides. Jericho was about 5 miles from the Jordan. It was the most significant city in the Jordan Valley and perhaps the most strongly fortified in all the land. From where Israel entered Canaan, there was no way to proceed without first taking Jericho. It is possible that Jericho is the oldest city in the world. Old Testament Jericho was built on a hill. Its remains are found in a mound called Tel Es-Sultan. Archaeological records indicate that it had a double wall, the outer one 6 feet thick and the inner one 12 feet thick. The narrative of verse 2 is a continuation from the last verse of the previous chapter. One might logically conclude that the commander of the army of the Lord was actually Jesus Christ, here referred to as being the Lord. This name reminds us that Jesus is indeed God. This verse is an Old Testament pointer to the truth of the Trinity. The orders now given to Joshua came directly from the heavenly headquarters and the Father himself. Before its specific instructions were given, though, the Lord promised that Jericho had already been given to Joshua. No greater reassurance could have been given than this. There was no reason for Joshua to fear what he was facing because the outcome had already been determined. All he had to do was be obedient in the time and way in which he moved forward. The procedure. Joshua 6:3-4. God's plan was for the armed men and 7 priests with ram's horns to march around the city once each day for 6 days, and on the 7th day march around the city 7 times. What kind of military strategy was this? Jericho was on no more than about 7 acres of land with a circumference of about half a mile. So this march would not be all that difficult. The people in front would likely be back at their starting point in less than an hour. What is curious is God's rationale behind such an unusual procedure. No regular war weapons were going to be involved. What's going on? Kenneth Gainwell made this interesting observation. We all know God could have spoken the word and Jericho could have vaporized. The real battle with Jericho was not with the Canaanites, but with the Israelites. Not with the wall of the city, but with human hearts. The daily marches would have been a certain psychological effect on the residents of Jericho, but that was probably not the primary result God was seeking through his unusual operation. There was something else. God was about to reveal himself once again as a faithful and trustworthy God. Most of the people who had just crossed the Jordan River had not been born when the Israelites departed from Egypt and crossed the Red Sea. They had witnessed the provision of manna throughout the years of desert travel, and now the miraculous crossing of the Jordan. But just how deep was their faith? God would give them the heavily fortified city of Jericho in such a miraculous way that there could be no doubt concerning his power and faithfulness. We cannot help wondering about the responses of Joshua's leaders when he told them this plan. Perhaps they thought he had been in the sun too long and was suffering from heat stroke. What Israel did. Joshua 6:12. And Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. Verse 13. And 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually and blew with the trumpets. And the armed men went before them, but the rewarder came after the ark of the Lord, the priests going on and blowing with the trumpets. Verse 14. And the second day they compassed the city once and returned into the camp. So they did 6 days. Verse 15. And it came to pass on the seventh day that they rose early about the dawning of the day, and compassed the city after the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they compassed the city 7 times. Verse 16. And it came to pass at the 7th time, when the priests blew with the trumpets, Jericho said unto the people, Shout, for the Lord hath given you the city. Verse 17. And the city shall be accursed, even it and all that are therein, to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all that are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. The order of the march, Joshua 6:12 through 13. Joshua wasted no time. Early the next morning, he got everybody in place and began the march. Perhaps the priests are mentioned first to show that this was a spiritual venture rather than a military one. 4 priests would have been carrying the Ark of the Covenant by the 2 poles that ran through the rings on its corners. God has specifically commanded that the Ark was always to be moved in this way. Exodus 25:10 through 14. When David ignored this command, Uzziah lost his life. 2 Samuel 6:1 through 11. 7 other priests blew ram's horn trumpets during the entire time marching. They were in the middle of the marching line, followed by those carrying the ark. Leading the march was the main part of Joshua's army, and behind the priests came the rear guard. There is no reason to believe that the women and children were involved in this. They no doubt stayed in the camp at Gilgal. To involve them would have served only to make everything more very complicated. As it was, we can imagine how smoothly and efficiently this process worked. The priests were placed in prominent roles, and at the very center of everything was the Ark of the Covenant, representing the very presence of God himself. It was before the ark, both in the tabernacle and in the temple built by Solomon, that the high priest stood in the presence of God. When Moses set up the tabernacle the first time, God made his presence known by filling it with his glory. Exodus 40:34. In fact, nobody could enter the tabernacle because of this great glory. Verse 35. God was making the entire approach to Jericho an exhibition of his presence with his people. At the climactic moment to yet come, he would receive great honor and glory. The change in the march, Joshua 6:14 through 15. 6 days in a row, an army and a group of priests marched around the city and nothing happened. The only sounds were the beat of their feet and the blowing of the ram's horns. The absence of vocal sounds, verse 10, must have been mysterious and perplexing to the people in the city. Perhaps on the first few days they mocked the marchers, but as one day followed another with the same procedure, the mocking very likely was replaced by an eerie sense of dread. After all, there was no evidence that the marchers had any fear whatsoever regarding Jericho. Each day they approached encircled with absolute confidence. The silent, somber, confident demeanor of the participants might very well have had a psychological wearing effect on the people of Jericho. Did the tension inside the city become greater each day? What was happening with the Israelites? Was their sense of expectation growing each day, thus increasing their excitement? We are not told whether Joshua explained the final result ahead of time. The 7th day finally arrived, and everyone was up and ready to go at dawn. Imagine the surprise inside the city as the Israelites began their march earlier than usual and then kept going around and around the city. God had told them to march around the city 7 times, and that was exactly what they did. Surely in the hearts of the Israelites, the sense of excitement grew as the end of the march approached. There are times in our lives when God directs us to do out of the ordinary things. It is important to remember, however, that it is truly not specifically the things we do that bring about spiritual victories, but as we depend on the Lord to fulfill his promises, we experience some soul-thrilling events. The command of Joshua, Joshua 6:16 through 17. It would seem logical that Joshua had given these detailed instructions to the people before they began this sevenfold march. They surely needed to know ahead of time what they were to do when they heard the last blast of the ram's horns, verse 5. It would have been impossible for Joshua to explain the details given here through verse 19 as the horn was actually sounding. However, if they knew what to listen for, they would be expecting it and would be ready to respond. Joshua told the people that when they heard the blast of the horn, they were to shout because God had already given them the city. It was to be a shout of victory. He then explained that everything in the city was doomed for destruction, including every material thing and all the people. When Joshua said, the city shall be accursed, verse 17, he meant that everything in it was banned from being taken by the people. Instead, it was to be devoted to God for destruction. In this case, the judgment of God was going to be immediate and complete. Rahab, however, was to be allowed to live along with all her relatives who had come to her house. This was her reward for having protected the spies earlier. She hid them, sent the king's messengers on their way, and then helped the spies escape to the mountain to wait for a safe time to return to Joshua. The spies had made a covenant with Rahab to protect her and her family, 2:18 through 21. So Joshua now gave the instructions for honoring that covenant. It is apparent that she was a believer in Israel's God, so he responded to her. What Israel experienced, verse 18. And ye in any wise keep yourselves from the accursed things, lest ye make yourselves accursed. When ye take of the accursed things and make the camp of Israel accursed and trouble it, verse 19. But all the silver and brass and vessels, but all the silver and gold and vessels of brass and iron are consecrated unto the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. Verse 28. So the people shouted when the priests blew with the trumpets, and it came to pass when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat. The detailed instructions, Joshua 6:18 through 19. These are stern instructions were meant to be followed without question. Every material item in the city, with one explicit exception, was under God's ban and doomed for destruction. Therefore, it was not to be taken by anyone in Israel. In fact, Joshua warned that if anyone took anything that was accursed, that person too would become accursed. Everything in Jericho was doomed and intended for extermination. Anyone taking anything from there would be doomed as well. One would think that no one would dare disobey such a somber warning, but as Joshua 7 reveals, there was one man named Achan who chose to ignore the Lord's command. Why is it that we gullible human beings think we can ignore God and escape his chastising? It is significant that the entire camp of Israel would be affected by any disobedience. A couple of things appear to be behind God's command. First, he was making it very clear that he wanted Israel to have nothing to do with pagan living, including the wicked practices related to their religious activity. God's people needed to be separated from worldly activity. We serve the same God who required Israel to be in a pure relationship with him. Second, the principle of first fruits is obvious. This is the broad principle that from every gain we should give God the first portion. This is behind tithing and seen in many of the Pentateuch's commands. The first city was to belong entirely to God to do as he wanted. Later victories would not have such requirements attached to them. The complete victory, Joshua 6:28. Imagine the moment. The blast sounded and an earth-shattering yell arose from the marching crowd, which probably immediately stopped moving and stood in place ready to charge into the city. The huge wall of Jericho began to crumble to the ground and was soon lying flat. God had just manifested himself in a way never seen before. So when the priests blast on the trumpets, the people gave a loud shout. The shout reverberated through the hills around, startling wild animals and terrorizing the dwellers of Jericho in their homes. At that moment, the wall of Jericho, obeying the summons of God, collapsed. This great almighty God of Israel is also our God today. Questions. 1. Where were Joshua's orders from, and of what did they assure him? 2. What was the Lord's unusual military approach to Jericho? 3. What would this battle strategy ultimately teach Israel? 4. What was the order of march the Israelites were to establish? 5. What was significant about the positioning of the priests and the ark in the march? 6. What was different about the marching orders for Israel on the seventh day? 7. What would signal the time to shout? 8. What did God say Israel was to do with the things and people of Jericho? 9. What would happen if God's orders were disobeyed? 10. How does the text describe the final outcome of Israel's action? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, September 17, 2023. Thank you for listening. God bless.